So today's just going to be about California, apparently. Everyone wants to go out west. I'm here in New York right now. I actually lived in California for about 5 years. And it was an experience. I'm not even going to go there. Those of you that know me know that half that time wasn't even spent doing healthy things. So moving along, there's a few things that's happened in California as a reflection of what occurred, however, in New York City regarding Hasidic Jewish synagogues and their capacity, their gathering capacity. So it's definitely a tense situation that's going on. But Supreme Court gives partial win to churches fighting California's limits on indoor worship services. The Supreme Court told California judges on Thursday to take another hard look at state rules that ban most indoor worship services. A week ago, the justices, in a 5-4 decision, lifted tight limits on churches and synagogues in neighborhoods of New York City where the virus was spreading. The court, and by the way, yes, it is spreading in New York City, but it is spreading at a higher rate in particular areas. This is the same thing we'll talk about in an article in a minute. That's reflected in Gavin Newsome's of California's newest proposal for quarantine measures or lockdown measures, where if ICU openings if ICU openings decrease to below 15%, then those areas that the hospitals occupy will be locked down. And I've always been a proponent of, if you're going to use any statistic that's relevant, use ICU admission and correlate that with death rates as a more important statistic than just simply being infected. As we've seen in the beginning of the second wave, most of those who were being diagnosed as positive were asymptomatic. And again, this is also regional. Regions with higher Hasidic Jewish populations and synagogues have a rampant, exponential increase in infection and positive infection than any other areas. So if any areas were to be locked down, I would advocate it would be those rather than a widespread one that I feel like is undeserved. A and B is, potentially, it causes much more collateral damage than required. But moving along, the court said those restrictions violated the First Amendment's protection for the free exercise of religion. Rather than issue a separate decision responding to a religious liberty challenge to California's restrictions, the High Court issued a brief, unsigned order on Thursday telling federal judges in the Los Angeles area to reconsider Governor Gavin Newsom's even tighter restrictions on worship services in all of the population centers of California. Florida-based lawyers for the Harvest Rock churches in California said the governor's restrictions for Tier 1 mean that indoor worship services are completely prohibited for 99.1% of Californians, which is amazing. That's what I mean by unnecessary widespread collateral damage. You want to avoid that at all costs while addressing the public health issue at hand. While the court's order appears to have no immediate legal impact, it suggests the state's ban on indoor services is likely to fall. In late May, the High Court had rejected a religious liberty challenge to Newsom's earlier restrictions, which limited indoor church gatherings to 100 people. Then Chief Justice John G. Roberts Jr. cast a deciding vote and said judges should be wary of second-guessing state and local officials who are trying to restrain the pandemic. But since then, the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, rest her soul, and her replacement by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, I always get that wrong, ACB has shifted the majority, and now the court appears ready to strike down state restrictions on worship services that are more severe than the rules affecting retailers, offices, and factories. And I don't blame them. From a constitutional standpoint, I mean, really, it's what it is will you act from a constitutional standpoint or from an economic one, from one of a monetary value based on GDP or from one of, civil liberties at hand. Now, that being said, though, there is, well, wait, let me see. Yeah, let's finish this. Let me finish this. Because, we got some more coming up. The decision is another, at least partial victory for religious liberty advocates and a setback for state health regulators. California's lawmakers warned the court about the surge in coronavirus cases and argued this was not the time to relax the restrictions on large indoor gatherings. Drink some water. But Thursday's order follows closely in line with the court's decision, November 25th, to lift more targeted restrictions in New York, severely limiting worship services in neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens, where the pandemic was spreading. 2 days before the court's order in the New York case, Harvest Rock lodged an appeal of California's restrictions. It argued Newsome's rules discriminated against religion because grocery stores, big box retailers, warehouses, and meatpacking plants could remain open and allow large gatherings while churches were closed. They also said officials in Pasadena had threatened the Harvest Rock Church there and its pastor with fines and criminal charges. In defense of the restrictions, the state's lawyers said indoor gatherings where people congregate for an extended time posed greater risks of spreading infection. That's not wrong. The risk is particularly high when such congregate activities involve singing or chanting, especially when they take place in buildings with limited ventilation. And as laughable as that sounds, I mean, they're not entirely wrong. However, the state's risk-based approach sets the tightest restrictions in Tier 1 counties, which include all of California's population centers. There, the blueprint prohibits indoor gatherings for certain businesses and activities, including museums, movie theaters, restaurants, and worship services, but allows such gatherings outside. All right. A federal judge in the Ninth Circuit Court panel had turned away Harvest Rock's religious liberty challenge to Newsome's order. The judges did so by citing a late May decision of the Supreme Court, which by a 5-4 vote refused to lift California's earlier restrictions on the size of church gatherings. Thursday's order sets aside those decisions and tells the California-based judges to reconsider the issue in light of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn versus Cuomo, last week's decision from New York. So, with that said, I don't know if it's necessarily as a reaction to, but what I think is a more effective response, right? Gavin Newsom announces a new stay-at-home order tied to ICU capacity, right? So intensive care unit admissions go up. That means people on ventilators. You stay on a ventilator usually after 2 weeks. You probably either A, aren't coming off one, or if you do come off one, you're going to have long-term lung damage, and you'll need to be in the ICU for longer. And that's if you successfully recover, because you do have situations where there are complications that occur, whether it be of pre-existing conditions or as a result of getting COVID and either having COVID or having COVID and going through the ventilator. Basically, up until now, the procedures that have been used to deal with COVID, once you are admitted to the ICU, have usually either resulted in long-term hospitalization and intensive care or death. So if you see, statistically speaking, ICU admissions go up, not just infection rate, because again, we saw the beginning of the quote-unquote second wave involve mostly asymptomatic patients. That for me is a signal that if you have particular regions that have both admissions of ICU and death rates go up, along with infection rate, all rising at once past March levels, then those areas should be quarantined. It's kind of, and that's the whole thing. Broad national lockdowns don't work. Broad state lockdowns don't work. It has to be targeted. Regions of California where hospitals are in danger of overload will be subject to a new stay-at-home order, with some parts of the state projected to reach that point later this week, Governor Gavin Newsom announced Thursday. The new order will apply in regions where available intensive care unit capacity drops below 15%, according to the Newsom administration. Newsom said 4 out of 5 regions in the state, including the greater Sacramento region, are on track to hit that threshold early this month. The 5th region, the Bay Area, is on track to meet that threshold by the middle of the month. They're rapidly approaching it. The bottom line is, if we don't act now, our hospital system will be overwhelmed, Newsom said at a press conference announcing the new stay-at-home order. The new rules group California counties into the following 5 regions: Greater Sacramento, San Joaquin Valley, Northern California, the Bay Area, and Southern California. Santa Barbara, Southern California. Oh, no, hey, guys, run! In regions where intensive care unit capacity falls below the threshold, the new stay-at-home order will bar non-essential gatherings and require people to stay at home as much as possible to avoid transmitting the virus. It will allow people to continue with essential activities like going to the doctor, buying groceries, you got to get that toilet paper, and picking up takeout. You got to have that takeout. It also allows distanced outdoor exercise like hiking and outdoor religious ceremonies. Retail will be allowed to operate in those areas at 20% capacity. Schools that have already reopened for in-person classes can remain open. That's questionable. All playgrounds, indoor recreation, salons, museums, zoos, aquariums, movie theaters, wineries, bars, casinos, live audience, sports, and museum and amusement parks, which are really all the reasons you go to California. Throw festivals in there. Must close in regions subject to the order. Once a region falls under the intensive care unit threshold, it will have 2 days to comply with the order and must follow the new rules for at least 3 weeks. The new order represents a return for many Californians to the isolation they experienced in March when California was the first state to impose a stay-at-home order. That order directed all Californians to avoid non-essential social contact. Now, we don't really, right. I was going to say, this is the next article because there are some opposing arguments here. We'll read this. Senator Republican leader Shannon Grove blasted Newsome for announcing the new order without giving enough public health data to justify his actions. I mean, if you don't reach the threshold, then you don't have to worry about it. Not that I'm not a proponent for show and tell, right? Show your work. If you're going to, argue for something, you should definitely give supporting reasons why. But it's not like the lockdown, the imposition doesn't occur until you meet the threshold. And if you met that threshold, I feel like it would be intrinsic of you. You would think, well, wow, we really need to do something. So I don't see it's kind of one of those things where why would you be in opposition to something like that? It's an in case the ICU admission rate increases, thereby decreasing the availability, right? If ICU availability decreases below 15%, then we lock down. Why would you be opposed to that? It's one of those things that doesn't make sense. It seems more political than pragmatic. But gotta give both sides here. California pioneered the COVID-19 stay-at-home lockdown order. Now it faces a backlash. And also, let's keep in mind, this is, meanwhile, you have within the health community disputed arguments as to when a doctor or when Fauci says that he is not for lockdowns. The WHO said this as well, lockdowns as a primary means of response, right? It's in the words, primary, right? The primary means of response is social distancing, is you utilizing the masks, being cleanly, being aware. That has always been the case. Except for, particular subtle cases like when Fauci said we don't all need to wear masks and said that we do all need to wear masks. And then when he admitted that that was the case, he said he was worried about an N95 mask shortage for first responders and public health workers, which makes sense, but it does demean, the integrity of the office and of your word when you do things like that. But I digress. With coronavirus hospitalization surging in California and healthcare providers increasingly under strain, officials are eyeing a return to the kind of stay-at-home restrictions that helped curb the virus's spread in the spring. What is unclear, though, is whether residents will stomach even modified lockdowns as willingly as they did in March and April, when California's swift and sweeping action made it an early national model in the battle against the coronavirus. The surging infection numbers across the state, experts and officials say, indicate that many are already weary of restrictions and, in the midst of the holiday season, less inclined to stay at home. The politics of the pandemic also play a role. A cadre of cities and organizations have risen to challenge stricter rules imposed by Los Angeles County in the last week. Beverly Hills and a few smaller cities are talking about creating their own public health departments. Oh boy, that's one thing we don't want to do. We do not want to decentralize the healthcare response, right? It's one thing for regions to conduct their own health activity, but we're talking about large regions. If cities break down into smaller cities and communities break down and have their own individual, that's too much micromanaging to go on, honestly. Saying the county's rules are too strict and not backed up by the data. The restaurant industry was in court Wednesday challenging the suspension of outdoor dining. The suspension of outdoor dining. That doesn't make sense. While card clubs have lobbied officials to allow them to reopen. Others have cried hypocrisy after several top officials, including Newsome himself and the mayors of San Francisco and San Jose, engage in the same kind of dining activities they've urged the public to avoid. I did a few videos on that, and everyone from Newsome to the governor of New Jersey. You had Whitmore and her husband. All the governors and the mayors are conducting business as usual, but they do expect the public at large to kind of adhere to these what seem like draconian rules, and they are. But is it? I mean, hard times, hard measures. It's a difficult decision. I understand that. And it's like there are gray areas that can be walked given the right circumstances. And my whole thing is, why is it only now that some people are realizing that? Like, I'm usually not a fan of Gavin Newsom, but I do applaud this action in relation to ICU availability. That's very important, because if COVID, I mean, I can't say it, if the beer bug has mutated to a point where it is ravaging the upper respiratory systems of its victims more so than anything else, then you're going to see a massive uptick in ventilation, in the need for ventilation machines. And that's like, this is one follows the other. More ICU admissions, more ventilation machines means that the disease is mutated and is now attacking the upper respiratory system more than anything else. That's an indicator of what, not only what it's doing, but that we need to quarantine those areas. 1, 2, 3. But I digress. Let me stop. Without further action, California risks one of the worst public health catastrophes in the state's modern history, with the state's death toll of nearly 20,000 plausibly doubling by the end of winter. Already intensive care units and a number of hospitals statewide are close to reaching their normal staffed capacity. And so yeah, it goes on. We don't need to swing that far. Don't want to make this too lengthy, but yeah, it's very much understandable that there would be opponents of the lockdowns, especially given once the lockdowns occurred, the massive reopenings caused a resurgence of the virus sooner than most other states as well, right? They led the way in lockdowns. They led the way in the resurgence of the virus. But at least it's as targeted as it could be to what I think is an important statistic, and that's ICU admissions. But I digress. If you like what I'm doing, please like and share and subscribe, and be well to each other.